Good morning and welcome to The Informed. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, following the release of the Victoria's state budget on Tuesday this week, has seemingly punished the following people: property investors, private schools, big business, and public sector workers in a big taxing budget that fails to stop Victoria's ever-increasing debt, which is estimated to spiral to something phenomenal like $171.4 billion by 2026. And business groups and ratings agencies on Tuesday warned that Victorian Labor's new decade-long tax regime, unveiled as part of measures to pay back $31.5 billion of COVID debt, could in fact result in an exodus of investment from Victoria. Welcome, everybody. The Victorian state budget seems to have many Victorians offside, but was it inevitable, given that we had the COVID debt and we had to get our way out of that? I just want to welcome to today's program Reuben Humphreys. Reuben, welcome. Mario Beeks and Ryan Smith. Ryan, you might kick off with you today, given that this is right up your alley.
Yeah.
Has Premier Daniel Andrews and his cohort got this horribly wrong, and are we headed on a road to nowhere?
Well, they've got it horribly wrong for years. I mean, we had a $22 billion debt when they took office in 2014, and now we're targeted, as you said, to hit $171 billion. It's actually quite frightening in many ways. They can blame COVID, they can blame a whole bunch of other things, but every state in Australia experienced the pandemic, and no one is in the position we're in. And every half-decent economist or commentator will tell you that the road to ruin, as far as our debt was concerned, was the government was well on the way down that road before COVID hit. What frightens me most about this is that it is class warfare writ large. It is people that send their kids to private schools. If you own a property, if you are doing in any way well for yourself or trying to do well for yourself, you are going to get targeted. And if we couple the property tax with Albanese's assault on our superannuation that's been well and truly flagged, where are Australians or Victorians supposed to put their money going forward? In fact, the government's saying don't save. Go for your house, send your kid to a private school. Don't make any extra money because you are going to be demonised by this government and penalised by this government. It's really a terrible, terrible situation for Victorians, and I really don't know how it's going to end, because we, prior to the last election, made this very clear to Victorians that this type of high spending, high taxing government was going to continue in their habits that they'd already established.
Well, that's a very bleak picture that you're painting, Ryan, but I can't help but agree that that's exactly where we're heading. Mario, of course, in New South Wales, you didn't experience what we experienced here in Victoria, the legacy of lockdown. So as far as Sydney-siders and New South Welshmen are concerned, or New South Welsh people are concerned, I'd imagine things are a lot more buoyant.
Look, I was always surprised how Daniel Andrews. Look, it talks about his incompetence. I mean, when he has people who are governing with the money and the people's lives who have no working experience in their life, and they never use their own money for anything. That's what expecting. And it's like I was always admiring his courage to go in. You don't forget, the police you saw in Victoria was heavily being invested. When I saw the equipment, that is a tremendous amount of money of taxpayers go to the equipping the police or Victoria Police to actually to suppress people to say I'm not happy. Now we're seeing that debt, and it's going to be worse. Look, we are lucky in New South Wales. We had the government which was try to have be sensitive, have the open shops at least, do some things. But Victoria, it's a brutality. It's like and I don't understand how this is going to be returned, except that someone's going to bail out. That's a lot of money. I think it's going to be sort of how to say a domino effect. Maybe guys, you can convince me otherwise, but I think that debt from Victoria is going to be domino effect in other states as well.
Thanks for that. And I want to cycle back in a minute to both Reuben and Mario, in particular in relation to I think one of the lowest moments of COVID in Victoria when you had Housing Commission lockdown and using brute force. So we have two elements here. We have an attitude about community, but we also have the willingness, as Ryan's identified, to go all-out class wars, if you will, between the haves and the have-nots, rather than building a strong society that employs the have-nots and making sure that they're doing okay as well. Ruben, given your interest in community development, how do you see this playing out, this rather, or it's not rather, but this very draconian, heavy-handed, you know, we've got to get every scrap of money we can from those that have it. So how do you see that playing out across the community as a whole?
I think the prospects are actually quite dark and quite scary when we think about it. Labor in Victoria have reached quite an interesting point. During the lockdowns, during much of what went on with the pandemic, what we have seen is a willingness from Labor to brutalise, to attack, to disadvantage people who, within their logic and their tradition, are already significantly disadvantaged. It was the new Australian communities, it was Indigenous communities, it was women, young people who were suffering the most and the soonest and for the longest during lockdowns. And we saw, as Mario indicated, a police state emerging and really attacking them in Melbourne's west and on the other side of the city, in particular in and around Dandenong, which is just a few kilometres down the road from where I live. And it's interesting that Labor have made the calculus that these communities no longer are a significant voting bloc that they need to worry about and protect. So we're seeing this transition of Labor to a middle class that they now consider to be their voting base, and they're still using the rhetoric of let's eat the rich to afford everything else. So I'm really quite pessimistic about what the next few years holds for all of Victoria's minorities, and it is interesting that in Victoria, that has such a social conscience, that we now have a Labor Party that is becoming a police state.
Mario,
That is true.
interested in your thoughts in particular. You know, you've identified the arming of police, the weaponizing, yes, the further weaponizing of Victoria Police. How do you see this playing out in a draconian state?
Look, you know, what Daniel Andrews and the government in Victoria forgot that what's happened in Victoria was echoing across the globe, even today. In many forums, I can see it, you know, I can see across the many TVs. And, you know, Daniel Andrews, if we just start with the one thing, Ron, you can correct me. Daniel Andrews used the taxpayers' money to do the Facebook analysis, or what was his one, you know, someplace. I mean, did you understand? If I've done this to my money, my company, and don't pay my employees, I'll end up in court or something like this, right? So that's just a start. But when I saw the police, and for somebody who has spent so much time in the force and anything else, I think myself, this is paramilitary organization. This is not the police. The equipment, every cop you see there, it's just a count. It's like at least between $7,500 to $12,000 equipment. And when you put in perspective how many thousands of these cops were there, plus the logistics, plus the drones, plus, you know, everything, social media, control and monitoring. I mean, when you go in that expenditure, you don't think what's going to happen tomorrow. And as I say, unfortunately, people are being told that, you know, that COVID is the one thing, then eventuated, but the fear was being placed. Now somebody needs to pay. And of course, politicians, as are now in the Labor in Victoria, they don't care because it's not their money. They know that someone's going to pay it, but who's going to pay it? Because there's no industry, there's nothing happening. In Sydney, it's difficult, and not in Melbourne. So I try to understand how this is going to now, you know, like as I said, domino effect, how this is going to come now in the New South Wales, how it's going to come other states, Queensland as well. So I don't know, I don't understand that much investment into police.
So Ryan, this is fascinating. If in fact Dan Andrews is tapping into the middle class rather than the usual supporter base that you could have banked on to vote Labor, is that a very deliberate move on his part in terms of the numbers game?
Look, I think prior to this budget, that would have been a reasonable argument. This budget attacks the middle class. I mean, this budget attacks those people who have saved their money to whether send their kids to a private school or buy one or two investment properties. So I think, obviously, Andrews is a lot of things. He's a very, very competent politician. He's not a very competent administrator of public money. But I think, there's no question that the 2026 budget's going to be very shiny and happy, and Victorians will be thanked for doing their share over the previous few years and all that sort of stuff. So, I've no doubt that this is classic, get rid of the bad news in the first year of a 4-year term and raise as much money as you can. But I hope people, unfortunately, as I've learned from the COVID response, don't have very long memories. So I don't know how they're going to feel about being taxed, but I think this is a steady spiral downwards. I mean, we've got around 6,000 businesses getting extra payroll tax. I mean, why would you invest in Victoria? You don't need to.
Yeah.
I'll be the first to say, I've got an investment property. It's in New South Wales because, well, I wanted to buffer myself from any work that I did as a politician in this state, but I'm pretty pleased that I'm not going to be captured by the government's tax. It's extraordinarily bad. Businesses are leaving. 860,000 Victorians have got a new or increased tax as far as their land tax burden is concerned. It is actually horrendously bad because you're going to have less investment in property. And he spent the last few years demonising anyone with money. They've got Labor politicians on Twitter saying, how many investment properties do you need? Like, sell them. Seriously? Are we not supposed to make life as good as we can for ourselves and our children by saving?
But that's a message. That's a message what the government sends out. That's what's going to happen to come in Victoria. But I'm not sure. Am I correct? Please correct me if I'm wrong. But isn't that all these immigrants coming in Victoria to live? Isn't that? I mean, and now you think it's sort of like, look, as I say again, I'm not an economist. I'm the business owner, and it takes, as you all guys, experience in your life. When you're managing something which is your own. I don't know how they're going to adjust Victoria on that influx of these immigrants, because in economy like this, you're pouring the new generations of people into the system. That is a recipe for the disaster. That's a try to understand who sits there behind the desk. And say, like, guys, this is right, this is wrong. I mean, it doesn't make a sense.
So you're right, because you've got all those new people are going to exacerbate the housing crisis. The Andrews Labor government's infrastructure program means that he's cannibalised all the workers from the private sector, which is a big contributing factor to the fallovers that we've seen with Porter Davis and a number of other residential builders. Pouring immigrants into Victoria in the next few years, and I'm all for skilled and unskilled immigration, I actually am, but in the current crisis, I don't know how they're going to get housed. I don't know how anyone's going to expect that rents are going to stay at a manageable level for people if you're just putting that extra pressure into the market.
And not only that, it's that contrast or comparison, if you will, with their previous existence. If they are sold the dream that somehow Australia, and in particular Victoria, is the place to be when it's not, that dream is going to quickly sour. How does that also play out, Ruben, in terms of community development? If you've got a disenfranchised or increasingly disenfranchised sectors of our community, people that, forget the missing middle, we're dropping people left, right and centre right across all class.
Well, Victoria is rapidly becoming Australia's version of California. We are creating the conditions that will ultimately see a Titanic flip in Victoria's politics. It's coming, and it will be coming at the cost of Labor's own immediate short-term advantage. For them, there is a short and quick injection of economic success by bringing in more consumers, and for them that's exporting the cost, because most of the welfare services are being provided at a federal level, and the consumers are being brought into Victoria as immigrants. And Victoria really doesn't care if they're bringing any kind of skilled capacity into the economy or not. They just want consumers. That's really damaging all the other disadvantaged communities already in Victoria, that are already concentrated in Victoria more than the other states, and really aggravating those disadvantages. And then on top of that, the tax ideology that they're bringing forward is classic Labor eat the rich ideology. It's attacking the source of income that would prop up, support the state and support the disadvantaged. But those are the things that are under attack. And I think, again, I partly agree with Ryan. Yes, it's self-destructive. It is attacking the middle class, but at the same time, they're still appealing to the middle class. They're appealing to the new middle class who have brought Labor ideology with them. You know, if you've got a second house, then you know you're somehow richer than everybody else, and you should be attacked. And that's the logic. They don't care. They just really don't care.
But of course, that's what everybody hopes to aspire to. As Ryan said, it's built into our DNA that, you know, we want more sticks than the next person. We want a bigger fire at the cave mouth than the next person. It's in human DNA to want to aspire. You know, Trump came to power on the back of aspiration, if you will. Him being that wealthy figure was inspirational to those that don't have, apart from his crackpot ideology. We don't need to go there, but we have. I'd say, Ryan, we've got a real problem in terms of this notion of who is wealthy, and therefore who is right for attack. To pick up Ruben's comment, and I think in particular about the rezoning and development. You know, that uptake tax, if you rezone and get an uplift. I think about everybody on the fringe. I think about migrant families that, for example, decided, you know, to farm swathes of land outside of Melbourne. And I think that they thought, well, if we work long enough and hard enough, we might break even every year, but it's okay. We've got this nest egg at the end. We've got this land, and that's the last thing that we will part with. So these taxes, now, and not everybody's aware of them. So there's a whole swathe also of sneaky taxes being brought in, again, without the public being aware of them until they get bitten by them.
Look,
What's your take on that, Ryan?
Well, I think I just want to pick up on something that you said about identifying, you know, and deciding who's rich and who isn't. The vast majority of Australians who the Labor Party are deeming as rich actually work bloody hard to get there. You know, there's very few Australians who actually got handed, you know, a multi-million-dollar portfolio. I'm not saying there's not some in every Western country, and indeed countries around the world there are, but most worked hard. Most worked hard. You know, you send your kids to a private school. Most people work hard to do it. You buy an investment property. Most people work hard to do that. This notion that you're going to get a tax passed on in you know, VCOS chairman or CEO was saying, you know, don't put up your rent so you can afford it. Well, the landlords can't afford it. They can't afford the rate rises. They can't afford the taxes. They have to pass it on. And that's just, you know, you can't excuse the government's position and just say, oh, well, I'm rich, according to the government, so I'm not going to take the measures that I have to take. And so I think that's the key thing, is that we've got this notion in our head that people with an extra house was virtually handed to them. And that's just not the case at all. You've got to have that very base liberal value articulated, which we're not doing that well, I have to say. But that, you know, it's about aspiration. That's what Australia's been built on since Westerners came here.
Yeah. So, like, if I can add something on this one, like, you know, just a basics economy, like basic law of economy. As much as you increase the taxes, that's mean you're going to slow down economy. You're going to slow down economy. There's no question as, you know, like, with that's I say to you, Ryan, you know, like, you sitting there in the Victorian Parliament, and I think myself, like, who are those experts who are saying these things should be done? Because once when you impose all these taxes, you're going to slow down the economy, and inflation is going to, you know, it's going to become hyperinflation. There's no question on my mind that it's not happen right now. So, I was watching the other day, they said that Sydney is amongst 10 best livable cities on the planet Earth. And I think myself, like, based on what? We have no homes to live in. We have no infrastructure so expensive. Taxes are so big and everything else. So it's all this marketing. But say once when you impose the taxes, you're going to slow down the economy. When you slow down the economy, it's going to be a big hurdle, and it's going a lot of pain for everybody.
Now, Mario, of course, you're sitting there with a big smile on your face because you're in New South Wales. Ryan, you've got a bit of an investment property in New South Wales, so you're kind of smiling. From a community-based perspective, what happens in what is a relatively new concept called Australia? What happens when you have a state that's slipping inexorably towards being single A rated or worse? What happens to us as a state? And I'm curious also from not just a financial perspective, but Ruben's take on us as a community of people.
I think you only have to look at 1992, which most people under 45 don't remember or care about, but it's exactly the same. It's people leaving the state. It's a general malaise that goes across the state where people cease to be proud of where they live. I remember during the 90s when things were getting back on track, how exciting Melbourne was and how proud people were to be Victorians. But prior to that, it's just this general malaise where investors are leaving, people are struggling. The society, crime goes up because of all the related issues that occur with that, homelessness, a huge burden on the government to pay for things like, dole and welfare and all this sort of stuff. So it's just a general deterioration until, touch wood, what happens in 1992 happens again, and people say, I don't know much about the opposition, but anything is better than what we've got now.
Mm.
And whether that happens in 2026 or 2030, I don't know, because, we had all the elements in place in 1988 and Labor still got in again for another 4 years. So.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's the tip of the iceberg there, Ryan. Those who are actually leaving the state are a small number compared to those who are seriously considering it and those who want to but cannot afford to.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, that there are so many people, even those who have nothing and really no capacity to move or go anywhere else, who are desperate to be somewhere other than Victoria. It's a really, really strong sense of desperation. And further to something that Mario was indicating earlier, we need to remember the logic behind taxation for things like cigarettes and alcohol. The whole point of taxation is to stop the behavior.
Mm.
By heavily taxing something, you get less of that behavior. We need to consider what all this taxation is doing throughout the Victorian economy.
Mm.
Want to shut the economy down, then tax it so people stop doing money. That's what it does. It stops people doing things.
Well, it's actually, yeah, like Ruben is right. I also saw the Twitter, that Daniel Andrews posted yesterday something. He's again about trains. We make it trains for the Victorians. We make it trains. And I think myself, like, what else is coming from Victoria? What are you manufacturing? And this is the problem in communism when you have the socialist, proletariat, unions. They're all like, we're gonna do it. We want money. Oh, money. We're gonna, and then like nothing's happening. Actually, just taxes. In 80s, what's happening exactly scenario. As Ryan pointed, 92, I was in Australia, but in 80s that's what's happening with those taxes in communist countries. Taxes was going higher and higher, try to catch up, and eventually the snowball, just the avalanche was happening, and the society just collapsed. Collapsed, and how ended up in all these, atrocities. Across the Europe. But what I try to say, Victoria is a beautiful state, and it always going to be a beautiful state, and the people, it's just being governed in a way that, don't worry, it's going to raise the taxes. Who's going to pay? People are going to pay taxes. But let's go invest into police. Let's go give them more money into police. Let's go give more money into the surveillances, this and this and that. instead of addressing the issues what's happening. Same in Australia, same in New Sydney,
Yeah, you need to pay more for police because there's a need for more police, and there's a need for more police because there are more people in Victoria who are either upset or are so disadvantaged that they are turning to crime as a way of climbing the ladder and trying to solve their own problems. We should also be mindful that our Premier is not really working for the advantage of the state. Let's look at the international context for a little bit. We've just had the Quad, India, Japan, US, and Australia, say publicly that they are tired of Chinese economic bullying. We've also had an open letter from the G7 attacking China for their toxic economic influence. And then within a very short space of time of the Victorian Premier returning home from another trip to China, he shuts down the timber industry in Victoria a lot earlier than was expected and closed or is closing the last white paper manufacturer in Australia. So from now on, not only do we not have those jobs, we have to import every scrap of white paper from somewhere else, mostly from China. In this arrangement, these big loans have come into Victoria from a state premier despite federal advice and federal security concerns because of the debt obligation that's created. And look what's happening. Who is winning in this economic war? It's not Victoria, and China is getting a good slab of that money. So we really need to consider the ethics, the motive, the intention of our premier, who is arming and equipping a massive police state to be able to quell unrest from a population that are really becoming quite frustrated, quite poor, and quite angry with their leader.
If this were a business, the share price would be in the toilet, so to speak. And the difficulty, of course, when you've got Albanese and Canberra, there are no breaks. There are no words of caution coming Dan Andrews' way. And Ryan, unfortunately, yes, your party is depleted in terms of its power base and its voice. We really do need strong opposition, or do we bring back Jeff? Just asking the question.
Well, it would be very, if we're going back to someone from 25 years ago, that's a sad indictment.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And that's when people get desperate, though. You know, what straws do we grasp at to try and stem the tide of what we know Dan Andrews is doing? He's both CEO and chairman of the board, and it's going to create a lot more grief. And as Ruben says, these are real people's lives. These are people that are going to end up in desperate straits because of decisions that's being taken by our Premier and his cohort. Thanks for joining us today on The Informed. I've been your host, Caroline Council. Thanks, Ruben. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Mario.
Thank you.